Hello, everyone, and welcome back to The Parent Solution. I'm your host, Kimberly, and this is episode 25. So today I have a guest appearance that I'm very excited about, and I cannot wait to dive into conversation with this woman. Lori, welcome. Would you mind telling our listeners a little bit about yourself?
Hi, hello. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here. I'm equally as excited. To tell you a little bit about myself, I guess I would say that first and foremost, I want to be known as unapologetically feminine. Um, I actually was a former leftist and former feminist, if you can believe it. But nowadays, I'm on like a mission to kind of spread awareness about the opposite message of that. And I also am really, really passionate about talking about the depopulation agenda. So that's something you'll hear or see me posting about. Honestly, I'm just trying to help create and promote just really fun and safe spaces for the trad community. I know, modern day society is pretty committed to the demise of that community, really. But I really want to promote it and kind of let people see it in a different light than they might have
Mm-hmm.
previously. So yeah, that's where I'm at with that.
Mm-hmm. To provide like a different perspective
Yeah.
on things.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Just,
that's awesome.
make it
I
more
like that.
fun.
Of course, I like it.
Thanks.
It's an absolute
Thank you.
honor to have you here, Lori, and I'm really eager. I know that was some of your ideas and some of your statements. I'm eager to hear the rest of them. I know that we've been planning on chatting about the current wave of feminism and all the tie-ins that sort of come along with that, particularly when it
Mhm.
comes to the family and to the educational system. So hopefully today we're
Right.
able to offer some solutions to our listeners. I think the first order of business though is to chat about what feminism actually is. So if I can ask you as a what I would say is an expert on feminism and femininity, because you've made it your business to know all about that, how would you define feminism? And then what's the difference today? What's the difference between feminism today versus feminism in the past?
Yeah. Well, a good question. So, I mean, feminism, and I think this is what most feminists would say is the fight for equality between men and women. At its most basic definition, I think that's what kind of the general understanding is, right? But
I think so.
what what I think it really is, though, or rather what it's become, is the fight for sameness between men and women rather than
Mm-hmm.
equality.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you know, just because I think if feminism really was for women, it wouldn't be only offered at the expense of traditional womanhood. You know what I mean? I don't
Absolutely.
think that women, yeah, I just don't think that women, I don't think that the automatic price to pay should be traditional feminine qualities, especially if you're a woman. And what I just find so ironic is how we live in a world that's fighting so hard for men's rights to be feminine.
Mm-hmm.
But when it comes to a woman's rights to be traditionally feminine, and feminism at its most basic definition would be kind of just the fight for equality. But what I really think it's become is the fight for sameness between men and
Mm-hmm.
women.
I really like that distinction that you made, and I think that sort of answers that question. Feminism in the past was about fighting for equality, and feminism today, the current kind of what's known as the third wave of feminism, has become
Mm,
about sameness. And it's not even about like you said, traditional womanhood anymore. As someone
mhm,
who can appreciate the beauty of a traditional relationship, I think it's important to celebrate all of the relationships that women are able to have. And I don't think that
yes.
you're right. I don't think it should come that feminism, that this equality or this sameness should come at the expense of traditional womanhood.
Right.
Do you have any thoughts in particular about traditional womanhood? Like, can we perhaps put a little bit more of a clear definition on that for our listeners? What is traditional womanhood when we refer to that? What are we saying?
Yeah, another good question, because I think it is actually pretty important to define that because there's so many different concepts and ideas about womanhood and femininity. And when we're
Hmm.
talking about traditional femininity or traditional womanhood, I think it really emphasizes a woman's priorities being marriage, family, modesty. If there's a spiritual or religious component as well to it, I think that becomes a huge part of her life. Not saying that, feminine women who aren't traditional don't encapsulate any of this in their, or that they don't embody any of this, is what I meant to say,
Hmm.
in their way of living. But um, I would say, when it comes to the trad community, it's that family, it's that faith. I always say family, faith, food,
Right.
and
I love it. The three
just,
F's.
yeah, yeah,
That's
the
awesome.
three F's: family, faith, and food, right?
Hmm.
Yeah, because it's kind of like a I don't know if I want to say the word commitment to the more old fashioned or old school, the more those traditional values, right, from the
Hmm.
past that we would see that are a little bit, do, do I really want to say a little bit? They're just completely forgotten almost in today's
Hmm.
world, right?
Yeah.
So
And it's almost
yeah,
as
I hope
though,
I touched on everything there.
yeah, no, 100%. And it's almost as though I agree with what you're saying. It's almost as though within this new society, so to speak, of a lot of people who are working, who have families, right? Who mothers don't really get the opportunity to practice traditional motherhood because they are so busy with everything else, right? It's
Right,
it's very
right.
rare to see a family that's able to raise themselves on a single income.
Hmm.
20 years ago, you might have been able to do it, might have been able to do it. 30 years ago, maybe.
Yeah.
I know 40, 50 years
Hmm.
ago it was definitely possible. And before 50 years
Yeah.
ago, there were many people who were able to raise their family on single income. But since we have
Right.
experienced this rise of, to be quite honest, in my opinion, this needless consumerism, we now have
Right.
this concept of everybody needs to what's the phrase? Um, keeping up with the Joneses, right?
Yeah.
That's not something that I myself or my husband participate in because I don't think that it's just not our values. But
No.
unfortunately, a lot of families we have had the choice to step outside of that. That we don't have to participate in the consumerism. There are a lot of people who unwillingly participate in that consumerist sort of society. And so for those mothers that have to work, that have jobs because they have, 3 kids or 4 kids or even 1 kid, like let's be honest, inflation is ridiculous and it's a lot of money to raise a
For sure.
family, right? Traditional motherhood, I think, is we can say politically under attack, but it's also financially under attack because oftentimes it's just not possible unless the husband works,
Hmm.
2 jobs and then he's never home, and that in itself
Yeah.
comes with a whole other a whole other sort of problem, I think.
Right. It's an attack on the family, really,
Hmm.
when you look at it from a slightly different angle. And I'm glad that you brought that up because I kind of forgot that in my own definition, like just that focus on marriage and motherhood, and a woman being able to stay at home to be, a housewife, a stay-at-home mom, a homeschooler, a
Hmm.
homesteader, if that's something she chooses. Um, yeah, that is so important, and I think that's a huge, huge, huge focus of a trad
Hmm.
woman's, entire life. And then just how you say, like, yeah, it was possible once upon a time for families to have that. It was the norm, right? Like going outside of that was what was considered, different. And now it's almost the exact opposite, right? It's
Hmm.
just,
And it's seen as
and
degrading.
yeah, like it took me, a f- it took me a few years to get used to just openly saying it. In my early 20s, no, I wasn't like, well, maybe a little bit. I was in relationships back then, but let's say my mid
Hmm.
20s, I should say. My mid 20s, no way were you going to be catching me saying I wasn't a feminist. I was like, Oh my gosh, I was so consumed with the idea of trying to prove my worthiness through the exact opposite of, showing that I could work and make my own money and be independent and not need a relationship and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt like admitting my goals and dreams of just like finding a man that wanted me to actually be at home and that he wanted to provide for me
Mm-hmm.
was somehow like one of the worst things. I'm laughing because it's like I literally thought that that was just like one of the worst things that I could possibly admit about myself. And
Right.
now it's just something I'm totally okay with.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's not even a question.
It's interesting to see how your perspective changed as you got older and as you went through more
Hmm.
things. And I think from my personal perspective, I think that the rise of the current feminist movement, as you referenced earlier, we're talking about the fight for equality is what it used to be, and it's now become a fight for sameness. And I think that
Right.
that's one of the most damaging patterns or trends that I see personally emerging from the current sort of third wave of feminism.
100%. And I agree. I mean, it's destructive. It doesn't work. Look at the world. Look at the world since I would say the 70s, late 70s.
Mm-hmm.
There's a definite change and I want to say breakdown of society that is
Mm-hmm.
is clear, I think, to anyone with eyes looking around. That just wasn't present. It wasn't as prevalent as it was in the past, and it's undeniable. You know what I
Mm-hmm.
mean? We can't sit here and pretend that we can't sit here and pretend that when you look around in society that things have just broken down immensely since women and men have been kind of almost forced into this gender wars or this game where we're almost trying to outplay each other. You know what
Mm-hmm.
I mean? And
Yeah.
especially women trying to kind of perform as or even outperform men just to prove sort of this worthiness. And
Mm-hmm.
it's like, well, why weren't you worthy before? Why? And just a whole other um, that's a whole other discussion that I could get into. And I mean, I could get into it right now, actually. But
I think you're speaking of like males and females and the difference between the two, and how we're in this sort of gender war. So like these sorts of patterns that we're seeing, these damaging patterns that you say that are, in my opinion as well, destroying the family, destroying the nuclear family for sure, and costing
yes.
us a lot in terms of a society, in terms of the traditional or the breakdown of those traditional roles. How do you see those sorts of patterns affecting males as opposed to females?
Well, I mean, I think first things first, we know that men have been completely emasculated in Western
Mm,
society. So there's that.
yes,
But
unfortunately. Not quite all of them,
if,
but most of them. Yes.
I'll- I mean, just the kind of the culture is very
Hmm.
emasculating. Even if
Yes.
men don't personally feel attacked by it and they
Hmm.
do embrace their masculinity, they're still existing in a world that is attacking their
Yes.
masculinity, regardless of whether or not they submit to it, right?
Right.
But aside from that, I just think that men, like a millennial man right now, who is like considering starting a family, for example, I think just the prospect of dating alone and finding a woman that might want what he wants could be daunting because
Hmm.
it's so different now dating in a feminist world.
Hmm.
It's almost inappropriate to be like a primal masculine man. So he has to first kind of overcome any discomfort with just the dating world. And then once he does start finding women that align with him, he also, has to try and start a family in a world that doesn't even really value fathers, you know?
Right. Yep.
And I just don't even think that a lot of masculine men, especially if they're uncomfortable with their masculinity and maybe didn't have a great role model or just whatever
Mm-hmm.
it is that led to that discomfort, if they honestly just don't feel like a high value masculine man who's just totally sure of himself, he might just feel like there's no place for him in this world, really, in especially when it comes to like a nuclear family. Like he might just think like, well, first of all, women don't even want that. And if I do
Mm-hmm.
want that, am I a bad person? And like, I think men are kind of told to focus on other things other than
Mm-hmm.
starting a family, and being a dad just isn't really like glorified and celebrated as much. When you look at a lot of like modern TV shows,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of the dads are just a joke. You know what I mean? A lot of the
Yeah.
main dads,
Mm-hmm.
especially if it's like, drama, comedy, those kinds of things. But like right away I'm kind of thinking of Homer Simpson, but there's so many other shows. Like I watch Everybody Loves Raymond, and just all the men in that show are just jokes,
Mm-hmm.
except what I find in these shows is the masculine men in
Mm-hmm.
any of these shows that I watch at least are often like older. They're from like a different generation, and it's seen as
Yes.
kind of like this outdated and like
Viking
kind of,
style.
yeah, but
Yeah.
even just like that kind of crazy old white man type of dude. Like it's almost, or just like it's just seen as like,
Something that's from the
I don't know,
past, something that's outdated, something
just
that's not really
outdated and just
appropriate for
like
today's day and age.
inappropriate, right? Yeah,
Hmm.
like inappropriate. I'm struggling to find the words, I guess, but yeah, it's outdated. It's inappropriate. It's kind of like, ugh. And I'm just like,
He's
well,
not quote unquote in tune with himself.
it's almost like the options that men have are, you have to be really, really emotional and
Hmm.
like be able to understand women and talk to them and be their friend and be their girl in a sense, you know what I mean?
Yes.
Or you're just like this like unemotional like prick, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's, I don't know, the options for men in the mainstream I don't find I wouldn't say are very good.
Hmm.
And I'm sure I missed out on a whole lot there, but
No, no,
you get the gist.
I think that you're on the money in terms of talking about how men are not like they're presented as kind of these two polar opposites. And you're right, we do live in a very emasculated society. And I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with women having equal rights. I'm not saying that there's like absolutely not. We should all have equal rights. We should all be treated as like human beings simply because we're human beings, nothing to do with gender at all. And I think that's where
Right.
a lot of people get confused or they get butthurt is because, oh, well, women this and women that. Like, listen, I will happily, like, I will happily stay inside and bake you cookies. I don't want to be out there changing the oil in the car. That is not what I'm meant for. And that's not what I want to do. Like, but if we want to talk about traditional gender roles, that's what that is, right? The women, the
Yeah.
mothers, they took care of the children. They stayed home. They cooked, they cleaned, they took care of like the farm and the homestead and the family, and like that was their job. Men went out and worked. They went out and got food. They went out and hunted. They went out and like did all of the political sorts of things, right? And I mean, now that's going into a whole thing about women's political rights, which is a whole different ball game. I believe that women as legal persons should absolutely have those rights 100%. But I'm talking about within the
Yeah.
home, right? There should
Mhm.
clear gender roles as to who is responsible for what. And sometimes those gender roles get mixed because, like, I'll be honest, I don't do all the housework all the time. It's not like I'm saying that we just have to do one thing or another, and those are very rigid gender roles. But for the
Right.
most part, like men were built, well, maybe the men of the old days, maybe not men of today, but most men were built with a certain amount of muscle in their bodies, and they were built for those sorts of physical activities, right? There's a reason why jobs that are physical labor, like construction, have the majority of them dominated by men. It's nothing to do with,
Right.
oh, well, men are better than women. No, it's because men physically are built for that sort of work, right? Just like you don't find a whole lot
Right.
of men in a seamstress shop because men are not, like, by and large, they're not built for sitting there and working with their hands with little small things and sewing, right? Like that's not something that they were biologically designed to do. And I think what Western society has done has really taken it like out of context completely and just said anything in the name of progress, anybody can be anything they want to be. And we've just completely thrown like any sort of gender role to the wayside. And I'm all for, like, if a
Yeah.
girl wants to be in construction, great. If a boy wants to go be a seamster, I guess he would be, then great, that's fine.
I was just going to say, you have to look at the majority for
Yes,
some things, not all things,
yes.
but I mean, we are literally redefining everything, rearranging society to
Mm-hmm.
make that like 10% feel
Re
comfortable. And then
Rewriting
like the
definitions.
90 or 80, exactly. All like academic theory is just like, okay, out the window, we're going to rewrite this for the,
Mm-hmm.
and redefine everything.
Mm-hmm.
It's like for this like small portion
Mm-hmm.
of the population, the human population that experiences what, I'm going to call agendas are being pushed. These people who are just not interested in a traditional, marriage or a traditional
Mm-hmm.
lifestyle, whatever it might be. The reality is that I think most people actually do. And something I've discovered ever since I've been, talking about this online is the amount of people who have like talked to me about it being like, yeah, but I don't want to admit it. You know what I mean? Like
Mm-hmm.
there's so many people who actually do want this lifestyle. They just don't feel like they can live it because we're so busy trying to cater to the people we don't want to offend rather than looking at the reality, I guess, of the situation. I actually want to say something else that just goes back to the very first thing when you started just talking now. And, the reason, just how you're saying, well, of course I want women to have rights. I believe we're human beings who should all have equal rights, right? And I always say to that, when people are like, how can you say you're not a feminist? And I
Mm-hmm.
say, I'm not a feminist because I believe women should have equal rights.
Mm-hmm.
And we should be able to have those rights if we are the most feminine, traditional woman that doesn't do a single thing that modern society expects of us, but that we feel inclined to be, you
Mm-hmm.
know? And people sometimes don't know what to say to that. And biologically, like, yes, we are designed for just most of us, not all women. And yeah, I acknowledge that there are people who don't fit into this category. Live your life, do your thing. I just want to be able to say that I get that same right. Okay. For some reason, progress means the people who had the rights need to give them up so that people who didn't experience those rights before now feeling included. But it's
Included,
like, are you
yeah.
really included or are you just kicking us out? You know what I mean? Because that's
Yeah.
inclusion. Being included would imply that you are also giving us, the space to do our thing as well. And that's just not happening, right? We
Mm-hmm.
are, yeah, like you said,
Right.
anything in the name of progress.
Mm-hmm. And it's this idea
Yeah.
of if I want to kind of point this one out here, it's this idea of acceptance over tolerance. And I find that that's a very touchy topic these days. I myself practice tolerance over acceptance. And the difference of tolerance over acceptance. So tolerance means that I give you the respect to listen to you. I give you the respect to hear what you are saying. I give you the respect as a human being. I would do this for anybody to listen, hear what you're saying, and absorb that information. But I reserve the right to disagree with you. And that's okay because I'm going to sit here and I'm either going to disagree with you politely and we're going to move on, or I'll disagree politely with you and you would get butt hurt and that would be the end of that conversation. But either way, that's how I operate. Whereas something like acceptance is like, oh, I see this and I accept this and I'm totally going to change my perspective for this. And I don't think that that's a good idea for anybody. And that actually sort of leads me to my next question, which is really why we're talking about this, is these sorts of patterns that are being pushed, as you mentioned, an agenda. I like to use the term narrative, but agenda works too. I like to talk about the feminist patterns, these sorts of feminist, not feminine, but feminist patterns that we see here that we've talked about, and how these are affecting our children, and how educational
Yeah,
institutions, like that is a concern, that educational institutions are
huge.
pushing this sort of narrative and this sort of agenda. There's a lot of other agendas that they're pushing as well. And those are topics
Yeah.
for a different podcast. But specifically in terms of a feminist agenda, I see
Uh-huh.
a very damaging pattern. I'm not sure if you have any thoughts on that at all.
Oh God, I mean, where do I, it's like, what thoughts don't I have about
What
it?
thoughts don't I
I
have? Where do I
mean,
start?
okay, you and I were both kind of like 90s kids, right? So we grew
Hmm.
up in that era that was really, really pushing the feminist agenda or the feminist pattern, shall we call it. And I think we both grew up with, first of all, the education system that we grew up in pushing the girls can do it, which is fine. It seemed like a confidence boost, right, to our generation.
Hmm.
But then it started turning into things like girls now having to compete against biological men. I mean, it's really evolved, and where it's gone to now, where like they're honestly pushing this idea that women, first of all, little girls growing up are taught to put career above everything. Education, career is like the main goal in life, right?
Hmm.
And I
Hmm.
just don't think that that's what most women want. I think a
Hmm.
lot of women want to be educated on their passions,
Hmm. Yep.
but because we're all forced to have a career in order to survive,
Hmm.
and we all, of course, want to have the best career, we all want to have the best opportunities in advance, and we want to be able to not only afford but experience. A lot of us do want to experience this expensive kind of, unfortunately, consumerist world that we live in,
Hmm.
especially in the Western world. We have to work, we have to go to school, we have to get a good job, we have to, do it all, we have to compete with boys, we have to, show that we can do what they can do. And I mean, it's even pushed, you know, once you get into the higher grades. I mean, not so much now, they're pushing this much, much earlier than when we were younger, but the pushing kids to, especially young girls, to kind of treat their sexuality the same way boys would. And I
Hmm.
just don't think that that's healthy for most women. Sex ed classes are very, very feminist and teaching girls to have an abortion rather than teaching them the realities of what's happening to their body. They're trying to teach women that career is, or girls that career is above everything, especially a relationship, especially getting married and motherhood, because you could do that whenever, right? And they push the idea that growing up, you are going to have to prove your worth in this world through your career, through your financial status, through
Hmm.
your ability to perform, through, and education is the way to get you there, sister. So, it's an indoctrination camp. It's like a
Hmm.
lifelong subscription almost.
Hmm.
I mean, they what is a prison term? Life is 25 years, and we're in school for how many years of our lives? Like
Hmm.
20 or something like that. I don't know. I mean, it's almost a lifetime sentence of education that guides these little girls who, honest to God, I believe so many of them just had a dream of being a wife and mother.
Hmm.
And really, if you asked so many girls like what they want to be, I bet you get a lot of, wife and mother, or like more creative or spiritual pursuits if you really
Hmm.
gave them the space to be, I think, who they want to be rather than who they should be. But
Hmm.
I think when you ask, a lot of girls, especially like in the later stages, say of like high school, okay, well, what do you want to be? And they'll tell you what they're going to college for. Yeah, I'm picking like this because blah blah blah. It'll be a great job, and it's all performance based, really,
Hmm.
in terms of I guess, like status in
Hmm.
the like employment world.
As though the creativity and the like artistic and the more feminine side of women has kind of been and of these of little girls in education has been destroyed. Now I like to say that it's education, not indoctrination, which is not your public schools, because there's all sorts of indoctrination that goes on in public schools, just in terms of
Hmm.
how they present things and what's done in schools. And it's not always the easiest to see because indoctrination is something that's very subtle. I do agree with you. I think that there's a lot of indoctrination, feminist wise. So, what's the sort of solution? I mean, I always am full of solutions. I like to talk about these problems and then present solutions to them. What's the sort of solution that you would say is something that's reasonable for our listeners here?
Let's just assume our listeners are parents with little kids, whether it's boys or
Hmm.
girls. And you're just thinking, well, how can I shield them from this? And I'm going to be real with you. You need to pull them out of the system. And I think you need to hire tutors such as yourself or
Hmm.
homeschool or hire someone like
Hmm.
join a learning pod, um, some type of alternative education that you can trust
Hmm.
that, isn't going to push your children to be something that A, they're not, and B, that they don't want to be, like to
Hmm.
let them really flourish,
And to
as a
let
human
them be
being.
themselves, and to teach them.
Yeah,
It's like teaching your kids how to think. And I say this all the time. You have to teach your children how to think. You don't teach them what to think. I was actually just
exactly.
today presented with a child who's 6 years old and informed me of something that absolutely went against my religious beliefs. I did not turn around and say anything to him that would have caused him to be like, "Oh." And so we actually had a really good conversation. He was like, "This is what I believe about the dinosaurs and people and blah blah." And I said, "Oh, okay." And he turned around, this little 6 year old boy, and asked, he said, "What do you believe?" And so and I said, "Well, I believe that God created the earth and that all the animals were created at the same time." He's like, "Oh, okay." He's like, "I can see how that makes sense." And like from the mind of a 6 year
Well,
old child, he's so he was so open to new information. And we had a really
yeah,
good conversation about it, about how, and the lesson kind of
well,
devolved into a science lesson. We started out with English and then we ended up talking about science, but it was great because it shows like his parents are doing a very good job with him and his brother, and showing them how to think and how to respectfully interact with other people, and that it's okay for us to
yeah.
have different beliefs as long as we respect what those beliefs are. And I just like, it's a very simple example, but it's just something that goes to show you that alternative education is much different from the public schooling system because it allows your child,
Right.
as long as you've made the right decision, it allows your child to truly flourish with their own interests and with their own passions, and learn about other people through the world, rather than the alternative, which is in a public school with typical education.
It tells you what to think, when to think it. It teaches you, like, any agenda that's being pushed right now, you have to conform to it. You have to be a part of it. If you don't agree, you are some sort of, I don't know, social
Social
criminal.
outcast or
um,
heretic or whatever you want to call it.
you're a heretic. You're
Mm-hmm.
you're just this just terrible, terrible human being,
Mm-hmm.
And so, um, what's nice about whether it's homeschooling, whether it's alternative learning, whatever kind of option outside of the system you choose, you really get to tailor it to the needs of your family. And this is true for people who are living totally non-traditional lives either.
Mm-hmm.
It's the same, really. There is a benefit basically to everyone to
Mm-hmm.
leave the system. I think honestly, that is probably my number one solution is
Mm-hmm.
just you want your kids to grow up in a world where their thoughts and potential aren't
Mm-hmm.
shaped by everyone else,
Yeah,
but
where they're shaped by
the truth.
themselves. That's not shaped by external influences and external forces.
Yeah, Yeah. And I
Mhm.
mean, even to a degree, alternative learning is still it's still imparting a set of beliefs onto children, and people can argue, oh, well, that's indoctrination too. And, you know, I'm going to sit here and say, even with imperfections, alternative learning is just almost always better than what's offered by the
Mhm.
public system and anything really offered by the government. Let's be real. I
Mhm.
take a libertarian stance on most things.
I'm
So,
right there with
um,
you.
yeah.
On the
So,
same
I
page.
mean, you get it. Yeah. It just take your kids out of the system, take them far away from the system, teach them, the truth. And can I tell you what that truth is? Maybe not. I guess we all have to figure that out for ourselves. But I
Mhm.
think most people who look at the public system and say that there's something wrong with it, what I love is that so many of us seem to be on the same page with a
Mhm.
lot of things, whether it's what they teach the children, anything, feminism, this sexuality and this gender and even just what they teach you, like, is healthy food. My God, like,
Mhm.
and just
Oh, that's a different podcast. We're definitely gonna have you back.
oh gosh, yeah, yeah, for
Yeah.
sure. I mean, I am studying nutrition, so that's
Mhm.
something.
That's
Um,
awesome. That's excellent.
any, yeah, thank you. Well, not to like get too off topic, but I mean, yeah, pull your kids out of school, do that now. Just anything that's God, anything given to us by the government is not for our benefit and is
Not for our
absolutely for
benefit.
their
Yes.
benefit. So,
I would say that
yeah.
there's always alternative options out there. Yeah.
You have to sometimes get creative, but when there's a will, there's a way, right?
I love it. I love it. Thank you so much, Lori, for being on this podcast with me. I really appreciate all your insights. I appreciate all your feedback and your valuable knowledge. So thank you for taking the time and thank you for being here today.
Oh, well, you're welcome. And thank you so much for having me. It was awesome talking. And honestly, I look forward to just another podcast in the future. We'll get to it for sure.
We will definitely have to have you back on a future episode. Like I said, thank you so much for being here. That is all for this episode of The Parent Solution. Remember, this is your one stop shop for all things educational.